right, guys, welcome back to the Weightlifting Life Podcast, your favorite podcast, and you show us that by going to iTunes or Google Play or whatever fancy platform you use and doing a nice little rating for us, and perhaps even taking a moment to leave a review that lets other people know how amazing Ursula and I are and how much you enjoy this thing. We have a couple questions here, but we're actually going to first bring up a topic that I know that anyone who follows me has heard me talk about 40,000 infinity times. Each time probably with a little more aggravation than the previous. But Ursula would like to discuss it because she was actually experiencing this from a coach's perspective last night. So Ursula, why don't you take over? And you let me know when you're finished, Greg, because I don't want to step on your toes.
Don't interrupt me. I was coaching last night, and one of the girls, she walks off the platform holding her pubic area. And so I looked at her and I just shook my head and I said, "Oh, the coochie callus." And it was the endearing name that I gave for like the little lump that you sometimes get right on your pubic bone if you don't pull the bar right, basically. And so you shouldn't have that. It shouldn't hurt that much. Now there's like sheer quantity of the bar like contacting your it should be right above your pubic bone actually where you contact it, but some people like mistime it or have a little bit longer arms or for some reason they hit the bar a little bit lower and they'll actually contact their pubic bone. And I was kind of retelling her my experience of when I was first transitioning and learning from a new coach, that he would have me pull the bar out away from me and then like intentionally contact my hip really hard, and how that created then a callus on that bone for a little period of time, and some obviously residual pain when you would contact it again, and so you'd then become a little bit gun shy about contacting the bar. And you shouldn't be. And it's, rooted really in just poor pull mechanics, in that if you let the bar come away from you too much and then just intentionally slam it into your hip, well, yeah, it's going to hurt because you've just slammed a metal object into a bone. Or even if it's right above the bone, you can still get a little bit of a callus there, like subdermally. And so I just had brought it up to Greg about how, this kind of becomes a recurring theme, and I think what was bothersome to me is that you actually see people teach a form of pull in which they'll let the bar come way away from them, like create a distance between the thigh and the bar and then intentionally smack the bar, and that there are other ways to teach that contact, because basically when you're standing with the bar from the knee to the hip into that jump position or power position or whatever you want to call it, then you should be standing to the bar as the bar is coming to you, but you want to minimize that space, even though there's a little bit of space between you and the bar prior to that contact. If you exaggerate that space, then sure, you're going to collide and it's going to hurt. But if you can minimize that space, you get, and it's where the old term like brush comes from, even though I teach a little bit more of a distinct contact than just a brush. Some coaches still teach brush, and it's really, I think, more dependent on the athlete as to whether they brush or there's a harder contact. But the closing of that moment arm so that there's little space between you and the bar as it contacts you should be done in such a way that it doesn't create pain. And so then that led us into the conversation that Greg and I just had previous to coming onto the starting the podcast, in which we were talking about like the idea of pain in weightlifting. And if Greg wants to step in and reiterate, because I think what he said was like kind of spot on regarding pain and lifting and some sorts of pain that aren't really what you're looking for. Greg?
Are you sure?
I'm positive. Okay. I'm passing the baton. It's the relay.
There's a really important distinction between the type of pain and discomfort and one might say suffering in some sense that is kind of naturally attendant to more advanced levels of training for a competitive sport, it's hard work. And when you're training at a really high level, or even when you're not at a super high level yet, but you're really dedicated to something, you're really pushing yourself, you're going to have pain. You're going to have the aches and, strains and things like that. And those are the kind of things that just come with training hard. But that's entirely different from pain that is a direct, acute product of a particular lift. So if doing a snatch, if every single time you do a snatch, you feel like you broke your pubic symphysis, that's very different from like, oh man, my knees are really achy because I've been squatting my ass off for the past month because I don't want to be weak anymore. Those are entirely different things. And Ursula made a good point that it's there's more and more of this mindset. It's becoming a little more prevalent where that's kind of a badge of honor. It's this glory thing where it's like, yeah, my shins are bleeding, my hands are torn apart, so I can't even hold on to a bar. My fupa hurts really bad from snatching so well. And you have to learn to distinguish those two things. And going back to the pole itself, actually, Ursula, I want you to give people that analogy that you gave at that seminar we did together in Dallas, because I really like that about, the tennis ball analogy. Remember what I'm talking about? Or did you just pull that out of your ass?
No. We're talking about the angle at which the bar is coming into your hip. So if it's coming in at a higher angle, then it's like bouncing a tennis ball. Like if I'm going to bounce a tennis ball on the ground and I start with my hand, like say hip high, and I throw the ball down, it comes in at a high angle, it comes off the hip at a high angle. So, but the contact that it makes on the ground is a harder contact, and it causes that, the high angle off the hip. So now my bar's coming in at a high angle and popping away from me. If I think of lifting more like skipping a rock, then I'm coming in at a low angle and it's contacting, but it's kind of skimming, and then it continues and it moves a little bit away, but it doesn't, pop off the water, obviously, or, in this case, pop off the ground or your hip, and it stays closer to you. And a lot of times what people do is they'll pull the bar, it's like they're throwing the tennis ball at their hip, and then when it pops away, they think that like activating the wrist and the elbow and the chest extension or torso extension, that's somehow going to fix it. And all that does is mitigate the damage of the bar popping far away from you. But if you bring it in at a low angle in contact, then all of a sudden the wrist, elbow, torso extension movement becomes really effective and efficient in mitigating the bar, but it's not moving as far away from you, even though we know from the S-curve that it does come out a little bit. It makes that obviously the total displacement less, and results in what feels like a much faster turnover because the bar hasn't moved as far of a distance.
How's that for a geometry lesson?
Yeah.
Angles of reflection or whatever. I don't know. I was an English major. I don't even know what that means. But yeah, the point is, well, actually, I'll take another further step back. And you said earlier the bar should hit just above the pubic bone. And so I tell people that it should be between the pubic bone and the anterior superior iliac spine. So the forward, like high points of your hip bones, you want it to kind of contact between those two levels.
Right. That's the same thing I teach.
Yeah.
I just say iliac crest.
Right. And so that's soft tissue there. There's nothing hard for that bar to contact with. So even if you did let that bar swing way away and then slammed your body into it, it still wouldn't really hurt. And granted, sometimes you're going to not do it perfectly and you are going to hit your pubic bone. It's going to not feel great. And Ursula is very right. You will typically see people get very gun shy in the same way that if they hit their chin on a jerk, the next 10 jerks they do are going to look like bench presses. But the key is, well, I shouldn't say the key. There's a couple key points to this. Number one, that bar needs to stay as close to the body as possible without touching until the point that it comes into full contact at the hip. So just like Ursula was saying, that the closer it is, the less it will bounce away with that contact. Versus if it drifts. You want to
make the point as to why we want the bar slightly away from you?
Well, because you don't want it to drag.
Right. Friction.
So there's two. I would say there's another reason. I feel like I mentioned it on a previous show, but yeah, you don't want to make it any harder for that bar to accelerate. So if you're dragging it up your thighs or your shins, like some people do, that you're just making sure that less of the force you're trying to produce is going into accelerating the bar.
You're actually producing a force downward.
Right.
That's, again, going to be just subtracted from all of the forces that you're applying upward.
It's too much math in this show.
No, it's not.
Settle down. The other thing, though, is that if you are, let's say you're pushing that bar against the body the whole time, that means that more than likely it's going to be back toward your hips too far over the back of your foot, which means, number one, you're already out of balance. But two, that means that the bar and the hip are connected for a long period of time as the hips are finishing their extension. So you're putting all this horizontal force on the bar, pushing it out away from you. So those two reasons, that's really why you want that bar to move up and in towards the body, but being as close to the legs as possible without touching, pretty much until the trunk is vertical. The knees have come under the bar, the trunk is vertical. In nearly the end of that second pole, and then that bar comes into contact right at the hip. And so even if this drives me crazy, is that there are, you have these, like, people create this false dichotomy where it's you either slam the bar with your hips or you extend perfectly vertically with the bar 4 feet in front of you and have no power. There's a lot of area in between those two extremes. So I'm like Ursula, and both of us teach a pretty good contact with the hip and the bar. The difference is how the bar and hips come together and what happens afterward. So in no way are we suggesting that your hip extension not be as forceful and explosive as possible. Of course we want it to be as forceful and explosive as possible. Or
that there be no contact. We both realize that there's going to be a fairly significant contact. And I think if you look at both of our lifters, all of our lifters in the body of our work, you see that.
Yeah. Think of it this way. If the finished position of a snatch or a clean has the legs approximately vertical and then the hips hyperextended slightly so that the shoulders are behind the hips, there's no way the bar cannot be in full contact with the body unless it's an extremely light weight that you've already swung out prior to that point. So in other words, brand new lifters with PVC pipes and 10 kilo bars who are just like blasting it off the floor and bypassing that whole center part of the movement. Mm-hmm. It's impossible to finish an extension of a snatch or a clean properly without the bar coming into full contact. Again, the issue is what distance was between it. The other thing too to keep in mind that I should have mentioned earlier is that the extension of the legs that is occurring with that final extension of the hips will control to a huge degree that the nature of that collision. So if the legs are extending, you're almost the hips are moving upward as they extend rather than forward as they extend. So imagine the difference between a vertical jump and a kettlebell swing. In a swing, right, the hips just slam straight forward. It's a completely horizontal hip extension versus a vertical jump, or what we want to see in a snatch or a clean extension pull, is that the hips are extending. So yes, the hips are moving horizontally as they extend. They have to. They're attached to the ground through the feet. But because the knees are extending simultaneously, the hips are moving up as that's occurring. So there's never a time when the hips just move directly horizontally against the bar. They move forward and up together until the bar and hips meet each other over about the middle of the foot. So it's like the bar and body come together and then stay together. That's what we're trying to accomplish.
Correctamundo. Right. And so, just to kind of wrap up this, this idea that if I'm now, there is the possibility that if you snatch every single day, like elite level lifters, even if they're hitting the right spot, I think that's where the coochie callus really comes into play. Like you're hitting soft tissue and you might get some soreness in that soft tissue and even like a small callus underneath, or maybe a large callus underneath. I've seen some pretty gnarly ones. But you want to learn how to stand correctly with the bar. And with beginners, you should spend a lot of time teaching them. With the different anthropometrics, it's going to be a little bit different for everyone, but you should teach them all how to stand the bar into their hip so that all of those things Greg and I were talking about are happening, that the bar is staying close, that they're not thrusting their hip towards the bar like they're doing a kettlebell swing. And so if you do that on the front end, and of course, Greg has lots of content on his site on segmented snatches and segmented pulls and all of those. We talked about that the last podcast that we recorded. Then you'll get that kind of work, kind of base set so that you don't have that problem. The problem with this particular athlete that I have is that she was trained by someone who taught her to bring the bar out in a way and then just kind of bounce it off her hip. And that movement, I don't want to say it even as belongs to CrossFit or as a result of somebody who did a lot of work with kettlebells and then transfers over and tries to learn how to do a snatch. And so they maintain some of their old movement patterns, and those things can happen. But, the problem with learning, trying to do that as your basic way of snatching is that when it gets to heavyweight, it's not going to work. And so we see it happening with CrossFit, high-level CrossFit athletes with lightweight, or even weightlifters that do some CrossFit. They'll go in and with like 60 kilos, which is, 100 plus kilos underneath their max, they can kind of just pop the bar off their hip and generate enough speed, like it's a 60 kilo kettlebell, and throw the bar overhead. And people see that and they think, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. But they don't understand that when you're lifting heavyweight, all of a sudden mechanics and efficiency in mechanics becomes paramount. And so you can't afford that loose barbell path, and you certainly don't want to, start creating unnecessary, pain through this little self-mutilation technique of popping the bar like hard off of a bone or even off of your hip out and away by letting it get too far away. And so these things are avoidable. And I think as coaches, we just run into the problem of having to reteach athletes. And so that's why I wanted to say something about it, because we know we have a lot of beginner coaches listening, and they see this, method of letting the bar get far away from the body and then contacting the hip real hard as part of a teaching process. And, as long as when they're actually snatching, that is not what's occurring. And so you may want to look at these athletes or coaches that teach this and say, okay, well, this is what they're showing me to kind of learn how to make contact, just to get the feel of a contact. But what are they actually doing when they're lifting? And if they're actually doing that, you're probably going to see them jumping like pretty far back and a really loose S-curve on the bar. And that's something that you want to take note of, because now we know that they're moving inefficiently. But if when they're actually snatching, that's not what they do, then you have to keep in mind that maybe they're just using this as some sort of tool, not the tool that I would use or that Greg uses, but some sort of tool to teach contact. I would say slow the pull down, segment it. I also do things like an RDL, with a snatch grip into an extension to try to teach them to stay over the bar long and use bringing the shoulders back, which is, the arms are attached to, and the arms are attached then to the bar, using that extension of the posterior chain to learn to bring the bar to you. And so there are other ways to teach it. The block between the knee that we use for the same reason, to teach someone how to, get over the bar and stay over the bar until the bar actually gets into the hip area for them to get their shoulders back at that point and create that contact by bringing the bar into them as the hips move forward, as opposed to just swinging the bar away. But I think we've probably talked that one to death.
Yeah, well, let me just add a couple exercises. Snatch from power position, or a dip snatch, where you're basically starting with a vertical torso with that bar against the hip in the proper position. So you're learning to kind of time and coordinate that final knee and hip extension together with the bar being where it's supposed to be. And then snatch, pull plus snatch. I feel like we talked about those the last episode too. And really trying, a snatch pull, no matter what kind of technical style of snatch you use, the snatch pull is probably never going to look identical to the extension of the snatch. But that's not necessarily the point of it. But doing that snatch pull plus snatch, it'll be really obvious right away if there's a huge disconnect between those two things, where you see someone do a snatch pull where that bar comes in pretty well. They get a pretty good vertical extension with the legs. They open up the hips properly. They have that good contact. And then they come back to the floor and do a snatch, and that bar is way out front and then banging off the hips. And so the idea with that complex for someone in that situation is you're trying to basically retrain the snatch to become more and more like that initial pull. So you might do 2 or 3 pulls followed by 1 snatch, for example, and learning to feel that coordinated leg and hip extension rather than really overdoing it with the hips and just completely destroying the bar with them.
That we have a question that's going to come up, hopefully. We'll get to it where we talk about complexes. And, the pull plus snatch just as a complex to me is it's a quintessential complex that really transcends beginner to elites. Like beginners use them for one reason, and you just explain that, where they may do multiple pulls and may even do that off the blocks just to start the whole process before you even take them to the ground, where you're still segmenting out the lift, trying to learn all the parts before you put it together. But then with an elite level athlete, I mean, it has the purpose of you can essentially get more pulls in without putting the stress on the shoulders and the wrists and the whole body by having to receive it every single time. So, I mean, the same exercise that in that particular complex for me transcends, utilizing for beginners all the way to my very best athletes, because in different ways. And so when we start talking about complexes, I mean, but it doesn't get stuck like something like a heaving snatch balance might we may use that primarily for beginners and then not really see it again with some exercises don't seem to continue to be used long term or sparingly used as an athlete becomes higher level because they're used for technical purposes. And then we bring in another array of training tools or exercises like the block between the knee. For higher level athletes, you don't necessarily use with beginners unless, again, you're trying to bring it in as a technical tool. It might not always work. I would probably do a RDL into an extension instead. But that snatch pull to snatches. So you'll see, like in my programming, you see it everywhere, from beginner to elites. And so when we start talking about complexes, and there's a question about complexes, I think that's like one of the main, for the snatch, one of the main complexes that coaches use.
Snatch plus snatch. That's one
snatch
of my
plus snatch. Snatch plus snatch.
Plus snatch. Sometimes called a double.
Snatch. Yeah.
All right, let's go to the specific to the incredibly general. And this, I thought twice about even including this question because at first I was like, I could just write this off as and not being something we can answer. But I think we can answer it because the issue is there needs to be a strategy here, because this is the human experience right here. Jenny asks, I feel like I reached a plateau and want to lift heavier, but unable to execute snatch and clean and jerk at heavier weights. Is there any advice you have? Jenny, this is the sport of weightlifting. This is the experience of every single activity you'll ever do in your life, where you start at one point and you want to get better. That's the whole point. This is the struggle. So the question is, well, I should say it. The answer is
that's the plight defined.
Yeah, right that is weightlifting right there. That I want to lift heavier too, and right now I'm unable to snatch and clean and jerk at heavier weights. I'm sure Ursula feels similarly. I'm sure every single weightlifter in the universe has this exact same problem. And so, but the way that we're going to help you is by kind of giving you some loose guidance on how you begin to even approach this problem. And first and foremost, you got to figure out what the problem is, because there are a million possibilities. First of all, are you really strong, but you're just terrible at snatch and clean and jerk? You didn't tell us. Okay, so for example, if you back squat 200 kilos, but you're stuck at snatching 50, it's obviously not an issue of strength. So I wouldn't tell you to go, you need to go work on back squats and deadlifts and presses. You need to snatch. And then more specifically, why are you stuck there at 50 kilos? Is it because you don't know how to pull it? Are you doing something like we talked about a second ago where you're kicking the bar out with your hips and so you're jumping forward, 3 feet and then you can't stabilize it? Do you have horrible mobility overhead or in the bottom position? Do your wrists hurt really bad when you hold a snatch overhead and you need to change your grip? There's a million different things. So point being is you need to really drill down and get far more specific. You need to find that choke point. Where is this thing coming to a halt and how do I break through that? Is there something you wanted to add to that, Ursula?
Well, I know you hate when I use the word efficiency, but I mean, to me, it boils down to, and maybe there's other prongs. I hate to say 2 or 3 prongs because then Greg always busts me when I throw out a fourth. But when we look at efficiency, it's, so is there a problem in the efficiency in the movement itself?
Why don't you just say proficiency?
Well, proficiency in that case, or efficiency in mechanics.
Proficiency includes efficiency when we're talking about.
Well, when we talk about mechanics, I use the word efficiency. But you're right; it's proficiency of the actual snatch and clean and jerk. So, are you not proficient at the lifts, and that's what's causing the problem, or are you not able or efficient in transferring the strength that you have over into the lifts? And those are the 2 things that Greg just pointed out. In short, I just said them in a more concise manner for once.
Oh, geez.
There's a third thing.
Yeah,
There's a third thing.
Okay.
Are you a chicken shit? Are you a chicken shit? Not
well, that's
you,
an
Greg.
incredibly mean way to put it.
Are you a chicken shit? I've seen people who are perfectly capable strength-wise, and they'll do a lift and you put 2 kilos on the bar, and of course the first pull you see it was fast, it was high, they have plenty of room in it for 2 kilos. You're looking at them going, that kid right now can snatch 5 more kilos easily, like with the speed and the height that they put on that pull. Tarayenko's coach used to actually carry around this little grid that he made that looked like a trellis, and he would look at it, and I'm sure he could see the speed of the bar because most good weightlifting coaches can. But on top of that, he would check, like, as he was pulling, like, where the height of the bar is. And, even on the most, developed weightlifters, most of them can adjust force. And so that's why they can pull the bar to, like, the same height. But on days that the bar is just flying, it'll go a little bit higher than they even thought it was going to go with the force that they've applied, so that you see that they have more speed those days. So he would carry this little trellis-looking thing that would essentially it was marked with numbers. So it was like a measuring stick for him, but it had little cubes in it so that he could see the bar's movement both forward and back, and the height of the bar. And so, like, as a coach, I always, you have something that you're judging the height of the bar. As you're watching them, you can determine, like, are they moving faster today? Or is the bar higher? So I've seen athletes that they're moving higher and faster on some days, and you're like, this is the day. Today they're going to break their PR by, minimum 3 kilos, probably 5 or 7. And then they just puss out. And so there's sometimes these mental blocks, we all know, that can get in the way. And so even though we're talking about proficiency and the efficiency of transferring strength over into the actual movements, there's always the possibility that somebody is simply not lifting more because they're a chicken shit.
Yeah. Or put more nicely, maybe you just lack some confidence, Jenny, and you need more experience.
I guess there is a nicer way.
This is why we can't have nice things. Everyone says that I'm mean, and I'm like the nicest guy on this show.
I'm trying to flip it for you because I'm getting the reputation of being the sweet one.
Oh.
And that's scary.
Yeah, I don't know about that. All right, let's hit this. Let's hit the complex question. Why not? We have time for that. Even though there's like 14 questions in this, it's just a paragraph of questions.
Yeah, no lie.
Eric asks, when is it appropriate to program complexes? Are they only for a cycle far away from the competition date? When you decide to use complexes, should you only be doing complexes? Or, for example, should you do a snatch-related complex and then just a clean variation, or vice versa? Or both snatch and clean and jerk complexes in the same workout? Are there any types of lifters that shouldn't do complexes, e.g. beginners, major technical flaws, etc.? What is the main goal for utilizing complexes in a training program? Whew, Eric, covered your bases on that one, didn't you?
Anytime, no, either, no. It depends. There, I answered them all.
All right, show's over. All right, let's take these one at a time so we can actually help somebody.
Oh, okay.
Instead of just amuse ourselves, which are 2 distinct goals. When is it appropriate to program complexes? Only for a cycle far away from competition date? Well, Eric, I would say, generally speaking, you're going to use complexes more often, more frequently, and in more higher volume, farther away from competition. And yes, I know that sounded redundant when I said more often and more frequently, but I mean those are 2 different things. More often, you're going to see programs using complexes far away from competition. And you will see those complexes used more frequently, as in more times per given period of time in a program far away from competition. So I wasn't just being stupid by saying two different things that sound the same. Ursula, notes on that?
Okay, so, the first point you made it was really about volume. Like I'm doing, well, and load. But, multiple reps, which are going to generally be at lower intensity. So let's say far away from a competition, I'm going to take a clean front squat jerk, and I might do at 75%, 2 plus 2 plus 2, right? So that's creating volume. I have a lot of reps. But if I'm going to use a complex closer in, if I took that same clean plus front squat plus jerk, then I can create the feel of higher intensity without creating so much intensity, like not having to do 95%. I can create the feel of 95% in a clean and jerk by doing, say, 85% for 1 plus 1 plus 1. Right? So it depends on what you're trying to achieve with it. If you want to use it in the conditioning phases, then it would kind of look to be a different form. So you might have like a 1 plus 3 plus 1, where you're fatiguing the legs before they have to do the jerk, and you're doing a lot of reps, but it's generally going to be at a lower intensity, and that fits into a conditioning cycle where I might raise the intensity, but not to a 90% above, or maybe right at 90%. If I do a 90 clean plus front squat plus jerk, that's almost like hitting a max clean and jerk.
Yeah, it's awful.
Yeah, but it indicates to the coach, like if I can get you to the point, if I can move you through the cycle to where you can do a 90 or 95% 1-1-1 in clean front squat jerk, or a 1-1 in the snatch pull plus snatch, is essentially like being able to do a double in the snatch. And so it indicates to me that your level has actually improved. And so, it just depends. If you're going to use it in conditioning, then you're using lower intensities and more reps. If you're going to use it, and it's just following basic principles. If you're going to use it closer into the competition, or, at the end of the strength cycle or somewhere through the strength cycle, then you might. And if you're using it as you get closer to the meet, the complex itself might change. So let's say
You just interrupted yourself. I'm sorry. I had to point that out. That was amazing.
I might use, at least you don't feel special. I interrupt everyone. You might do power snatch plus snatch closer in, right? Because you're trying to do speed work. So, complex, which complex you choose, and then the reps scheme and the intensity all. So that means that you can use complexes all the time, but you have to make those adjustments so that they're appropriate to that particular training cycle.
Yeah. Okay. So that's pretty much starting to answer that last question. So to summarize, Eric, your first question, just like you're going to use higher reps and lower intensity earlier in a training cycle, and then reduce the volume, reduce the reps, and increase the intensity as you get closer to a training cycle, and meanwhile go from less specific exercise-wise to more specific, as in more snatch clean variations, strength work, complexes, and then transition to snatch clean jerk, squat pull most likely as you get to competition. Same way, those complexes will fit in to that earlier part of the cycle, but they can still be used in certain certain variations, certain complexes can still be very useful pretty close to competition. I mean, I've used complexes the week of a competition. They're extremely light, but it's on, a really light day, for example, where, a power snatch plus snatch is a perfect example, where you have someone who you just want to keep that feeling fresh of really extending completely and being quick in the turnover for a snatch, for example, instead of having them do a 60% snatch where they're going to half-ass it and just kind of fall under the bar because they can. All right. When you decide to use complexes, should you only be doing complexes? And he uses the example doing a snatch complex. So in a single workout, doing snatch complex and then maybe clean stuff, but it would just be cleans or hang cleans or whatever, so not a complex. Or would you just do complexes across the board? I would say, again, you can do whatever you want. If you have
smart about it.
Yeah, if you have someone who's like, let's say snatches are totally fine, but you need to get some volume. Maybe you're going to do snatch doubles or triples. But in the clean, they have a really big problem completing, finishing their pull in the clean. So maybe you're going to do a clean pull plus clean plus jerk or something like that. So it's like Ursula said, you be smart about it. And just like in any other case, you select exercises based not only on the effect they produce, generally speaking, but the specific need of the lifter and how that is going to mechanically or otherwise affect them positively. Ursula, thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, like a good example, we just talked about snatch, pull plus snatch. Let's say you have a beginner, and this is really, they're not even really on a cycle, maybe per se, if they're not getting ready for a particular competition. But you would easily, I would put snatch, pull plus snatch, and then maybe a 3-position clean in one workout, because the weights are so light and they're still learning how to move. And both of those things are teaching them how to move correctly. For someone who is on a cycle preparing for an actual meet, let's say we have 16 weeks, I doubt if I give them snatch, pull plus snatch, I probably wouldn't give them 3-position cleans in the same day. But I would still give them clean work. We do snatch and clean work in every workout regardless. And so unless I was really trying to increase load, would I want to combine 2 exercises that are probably going to have more volume than if I just did them another lift, like a power clean and jerk with a snatch, pull plus snatch day.
Yeah, in colloquial terms, a complex, that's probably your big exercise that day. Mm-hmm. So, if you have clean front squat jerk or, God forbid, 1 + 3 + 1 or something horrific like that, that's going to take a lot of starch out of your britches. So like Ursula said, you're probably not going to do more than one of those, as a real primary exercise in a given workout, although it is entirely possible. Sometimes you just got to know
you're going to increase the load. Like they're going to do a lot more tonnage that day if you do that.
Tons
Unless
more.
You have, yeah.
All right. Let's see. Where are we here? Are there any types
you got to remember, people are still going to squat and pull in their workout, so that all has to be taken into account.
Oh yeah, they're not. Theoretically, you could have a workout. Let's say Monday you're going to do snatch, pull, back squat. Tuesday you might do some snatching and clean and jerk complex, but as more of a technical emphasis where the intensity is much lower, for example. So I could see that going both ways.
Well, like I mentioned, you have to be smart about it, and you have to understand the effects of those complexes on the lifter. And so if you're doing a lot of volume, that's going to fatigue them, and so then that affects what you might do the next day. And with the rest of the workout.
Yeah, that's called a weightlifting program versus an ollie WOD. One of them has like a planned progression, and one of them is just the thing you do each day. All right. Are there any types of lifters that shouldn't do complexes, such as beginners, major technical flaws, etc.? What do you say there, Ursula?
Well, I just mentioned where I would use them for beginners. So sure, I'd use them with beginners. I think complexes are really good for beginners. We do a lot of things like power position clean or hang clean plus multiple jerks. So we might and add some front squats in there to make sure they're learning how to rebound. So again, with a beginner, we're doing them for technical purposes. With somebody who has major technical flaws, I think we can use complexes to correct flaws. And so as I mentioned, I think that's, like snatch, pull plus snatch, it's one of those exercises, clean front squat plus jerk, front squat plus jerk. Those are complexes that kind of transcend like the levels of lifters. There are, coaches who eventually get to the point where, or don't like complexes at all and just want to have their athletes snatch and clean and jerk and think you can snatch and clean and jerk technical flaws away. I tend to use whatever tool I have at my disposal to try to correct the flaw so that it doesn't take longer to fix it. And I think complexes are a tool that are used to shorten the amount of time that someone's actually performing the snatch or clean and jerk incorrectly.
Yeah, and so I think really the answer is that there certainly isn't a type of lifter who shouldn't ever use complexes. There are certain complexes maybe that shouldn't be used by specific lifters. So, point being is those complexes have to have a purpose that is specifically beneficial to that lifter at that time. So as Ursula was saying, they're great tools in a lot of cases for correcting technical flaws, but also for doing things like improving, postural strength and positional awareness and strength and these kinds of things. For example, a segment snatch or, halting snatch deadlift plus snatch, things like that, where you're
snatch plus overhead squat.
Right,
Love
where you're addressing a technical aspect, but also a physical aspect, all in the same thing. So they can be incredibly effective. But if you have a lifter who has an incredibly strong pull, but is very weak overhead in the snatch pull plus snatch probably isn't a great choice. And so, if you're using something like that for that lifter, I would say it's probably a bad idea and you shouldn't be wasting their time. Snatch plus overhead squat, or snatch plus snatch balance, or snatch plus snatch balance plus overhead squat. That's going to be a lot more beneficial for someone like that. So it's not that there are lifters for whom complexes are not appropriate. It's that there are complexes that are not appropriate for certain lifters. All right.
That was good, Greg.
Oh, thanks.
You're welcome.
That final question, which we've kind of touched on a few times, but what are the main goals for utilizing complexes in a training program? So we basically already talked about that. You have, number one, a real basic goal is you're going to use them, earlier in a training cycle to accumulate volume and kind of more as a conditioning thing. You're going to use them to address technical flaws. You're going to use them to address, I hate to call them physical flaws, but yes, you are flawed physically in a lot of ways. So things like that postural strength, being strong enough to stay over the bar long enough, or being strong enough and aggressive enough to hold a bar overhead, blah, blah, blah. What else am I forgetting, Ursula? Oh, the other purpose is when your athletes just piss you off or they're whiners or something like that, you just make them miserable. Clean plus 20 front squats plus 6 jerks. Kill yourself.
My favorite that pisses them off is a climbing one where you do 2 + 3 + 4 or 1 + 2 + 3, and so then they're just this is just getting worse as it goes along.
Well, I mean, anytime you're going to give a complex, you're typically going to have more exposure to the thing the person is worst at. So you take a simple clean and jerk complex, clean plus jerk. You got someone who's a bad jerker, you're going to do clean plus more than 1 jerk. You got someone who's got a bad clean, you're going to do more than 1 clean plus 1 jerk. So either way, they're going to hate it because it is most likely addressing very specifically what they are bad at. All right. So did we cover that one well enough? Are we actually going to get to all 3 questions that we had planned?
If we're going to go over.
Oh, we're not going to go over.
I'll go over what? I don't even know. I didn't even know we had a time limit, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no one even knows what you're talking about right now. All right. So this one didn't even have a name. So somebody asked, I read all your articles on mobility and flexibility for getting a good squat position, yet still find myself losing the weight forward when overhead squatting. I feel like I have good shoulder mobility. I can hold a bar overhead and do shoulder dislocates with a snatch grip. Whenever I start descending into an overhead squat, I have to spread my feet wider than normal and my lower back seems to freeze, dropping my chest forward along with my shoulders. Is there a stretch I should be emphasizing? Yeah, forget your shoulders. It's your lower body. Okay, so this is something that I've addressed a million times, and I feel like it doesn't get through to a lot of people. We always see this. Ursula, I'm sure you see it as much as I do. People, how do I get my shoulders more mobile for the overhead squat? And you say, well, hold a bar overhead for me. Do all this stuff. And they have incredible shoulder their mobility is so far surpasses what is necessary for an overhead squat. It's obviously not the upper body. And then you say, okay, why don't you do an overhead squat? And their trunk is horizontal. Okay? It's not your upper body. Stop stretching your shoulders to death and rolling around on dog toys and tying yourself up in knots with rubber bands and other crap, fucking gigantic rubber dental floss or whatever the shit you're using. Get down, hips and ankles. If you see a picture of someone in the bottom of an overhead squat and you just cut out the lower body, you look at the stomach up, it should look essentially the same as a picture of that person holding a bar overhead in a standing position. There should be very little change in that trunk position. Through the movement, as they're going through about a parallel squat where the hips have to be the farthest back, in that movement as they'll ever be, you're going to get some forward inclination of the torso, but it's going to be pretty minimal. All right. So I don't know what your name is. If I knew your name, I would address you by it like your parents when you were in trouble. Stop stretching your upper body. It's probably fine. Start figuring out your ankle and hip mobility. Okay, so if you cannot sit into a full depth squat with an extremely upright torso, that's what you need to fix. So every single hip stretch you can think of, ankles, sit in a squat and with your foot flat, lean both your forearms on that knee and put all your weight on it. Try to close that ankle. People get fancy and they get a bar and they put weights on it. What a pain in the ass. Just sit into a squat and lean all your weight onto that one knee. It's so easy. You don't need tools. You don't need a partner to like sit on your knee and be awkward or whatever crazy stuff. It's just a matter of like chipping away at it all day long, every day for the rest of your life until you're a better person.
Yeah, it just sounds like he's stretching the wrong area. Like he's focused somewhere along the line. And maybe at one point he had shoulder mobility or thoracic mobility issues.
Quite possible.
And then and so he got hung up there, and nobody ever identified the other part of it, which is you have a lower body that also has to squat.
Yeah. So if you can, here's my rule: if you can hold a bar overhead in a snatch grip, in a standing position properly, so your head is pushed through the arm slightly, the bar is over the back of your neck, your shoulder blades are fully retracted and upwardly rotated, and so there's a very slight forward inclination of the torso. If you can do that with locked elbows and not fall over, you can do an overhead squat as far as upper body mobility goes. Okay, so if you can do that, but you can't do an overhead squat, you've got to check out your lower body.
And the key here is he tells us when I start descending, and I want to that desire to move your feet wider than normal.
Huge red
tells
flag.
you, that it's coming from the hip or the ankle. Like one of them doesn't want to keep going.
Yeah, and it sounds you dropping your chest forward along with your shoulders, so that suggests it's ankles. The wider feet and dropping the chest typically is going to be the result of those ankles not being able to dorsiflex. And so they have to move out, so you kind of circumvent that lack of mobility. Your knees can come inside your feet instead of tracking over your feet the way they should. And if your ankles don't dorsiflex, your shin gets locked in this very upright position, which means that your hips have to go way back. And if your hips go way back, your chest has to drop forward, otherwise you fall on your butt. So it's it looks like you're squatting in ski boots or something, where you're just locked into that angle with the ankle, and then everything else has to work around that. So my guess would be that the ankle is the primary issue here. And, like I said, good luck. You got to hammer away at it. It's a pain in the butt.
That would be like kind of that's a good assessment. Just by what he's explained, you can visualize it all occurring. Yep. And so, good luck with your ankles, because those things can be really, really tight.
Well, and the other thing too is, we sound so defeatist about it, but it is entirely possible to make this better. And the other thing too is that doing overhead squats, doing front squats, doing back squats, any squatting motion is going to help this. But you have to try your hardest to be squatting in that upright position, using that posture, moving the hips and knees together instead of leading with the hips and sitting way back and then trying to sit your butt in. And so the movement itself and doing pauses in the bottom of the squats as much as possible, all those things are going to help contribute to improving that mobility. And then not only improving the mobility, but then, concurrently improving the stability in those positions as you're gaining that new mobility. So it'll be a full meal deal, double whammy for you. All right. Well, we actually did it. We got through the full number of questions that we had, and now we have nothing left to talk about.
Well, we have lots to talk about, but probably nobody cares.
That's true. All right. Well, then we'll wrap it up on this one. Remember, you guys can go to catalystathletics.com/podcast and send us your questions. There's a little form there. And you can go listen to this on iTunes, on Google Play, on Stitcher. You can do it directly from our website. Please feel free to post comments, post questions on our site. Please post reviews, all that kind of stuff. Well, don't post a review if you don't like it. In that case, just keep it to yourself. If you love it, though, then tell the world. They'll appreciate it. All right. Any parting words, Ursula?
Nope. See ya, Felicia.
Okay. I think it's supposed to be bye, but we'll take that.
I want it to be see ya.
Okay. All right. See you guys.